When the French declared war on Prussia in 1870, driven by dreams of a glorious victory, they had no idea they were creating a great monster with their own hands. From the very first days of the war, a string of disasters followed, and soon the Germans were at the gates of Paris. The sight of German armies gathered outside the city would stir not fear, but rather anger and shame among the French public. This war, which marked the end of the period known in French history as the Second Empire, and thus the fall of Napoleon III, would go on to shape the political course that would carry France toward the First World War. After the war, which led to the birth of the Third Republic, France spent the 1870s mired in political instability. Coup attempts and efforts to restore the monarchy plunged French politics into a state of chaos. According to the Treaty of Frankfurt, France would pay a war indemnity of 5 billion francs to the newly established German Empire. Yet it wasn't the financial losses that truly shocked the French. It was the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. For France, this region symbolized historical memory, cultural identity, and national pride. The trauma caused by this loss reverberated through every aspect of public life for years to come. On maps, Alsace-Lorraine was shaded out. In textbooks, it was placed within special frames. The loss of the war became the burning core of a new French spirit of vengeance. It came to represent the desire for revenge. But the driving force behind French politics was not just the lost provinces. The very existence of the new German Empire was enough to fundamentally alter a French foreign policy that had long relied on the disunity of German lands as a guarantee of security. After 1871, France sought to seize every opportunity it could to contain its newly powerful eastern enemy. The permanent hostility between France and Germany was becoming a fixed feature of the European international system. The size and military potential of the German Empire prompted France to orient its foreign policy toward building an anti-German alliance. And the most attractive candidate for such an alliance, despite its vastly different political system, was Tsarist Russia. If such an alliance could be realized, Germany would find itself threatened on two fronts by a potentially hostile coalition. France had two choices: to remain independent and rely solely on its own resources to face future dangers, or to form an alliance with the only partner available, Russia. While France was trying to make moves in foreign policy, it was also going through a highly chaotic period in domestic politics. The 1870s saw fierce struggles among various political factions, leading to deep divisions. Parts of the French right still longed for monarchy, while much of the left viewed the Republic as an empty shell. In its early years, the National Assembly was split between Bonapartists, Orleanists, Legitimists, and Republicans. Each faction held radically different visions for France's future. While monarchists awaited a return to the throne, the Republicans, particularly the radical wing, sought to enshrine secularism at the heart of the state. The fiercest battlefield in this political war became education policy. Starting in the 1880s, secular education laws began to restrict Catholic schools. The first major crisis to deeply shake the fledgling republic emerged within the military. In early 1886, General George Ernest Boulanger, a conservative monarchist with strong right-wing views, was appointed Minister of War. Known as General Revanche, Boulanger spoke directly to the conservative, monarchist and nationalist sentiments of the public. Emboldened by his growing popularity, Boulanger began provoking the Germans. He ordered the construction of military facilities near Belfort and banned the export of horses to German markets. He even advocated against public performances of Wagner's well-known opera Lohengrin. These actions contributed to growing strain between the two nations. In response, Germany took precautionary measures by mobilizing a large number of reservists in case of a potential crisis. Amid these rising tensions, a new incident added to the diplomatic strain. French officer Guillaume Schneibele was detained by German authorities near the border in Ars and Moselle, within the contested Alsace-Lorraine region. The event sparked disagreement over jurisdiction and deepened the existing discord. A diplomatic dispute erupted over which side of the border the arrest had taken place on, threatening to escalate into a military confrontation. Boulanger's inflammatory statements only heightened the situation, turning the matter into a personal clash between Bismarck and Boulanger. Although the crisis was diffused a week later with Schneibele's release, Boulanger's supporters hailed it as a personal victory over Bismarck. Boulanger was dismissed by Prime Minister René-Marie Goebel, a decision aimed at containing the growing political threat he posed. The movement that would later be known as Boulangism was gaining momentum, particularly within the military. Support came from various circles: soldiers, Bonapartists, monarchists, and segments of the population who had lost confidence in the Republic. When he was elected as a deputy from Paris in 1889, the country stood at a crossroads. Thousands of supporters expected him to run for the presidency or even seize power with the backing of the military. Yet, despite high expectations, Boulanger hesitated. His rapid rise in popularity began to fade just as swiftly. As his political momentum declined, authorities removed him from the public stage and sent him, along with his companion, to Jersey. A short time later, he moved to Belgium. But when his mistress died of tuberculosis, Boulanger fell into deep depression. At her grave in Ixelles Cemetery, south of Brussels, he put a gun to his temple and ended his turbulent life. But France's hysterical suspicion toward Germany would not end. This paranoia, which would shape both foreign and domestic policy, combined with rising anti-Semitism to trigger a new internal crisis. In the autumn of 1894, a French maid named Marie Bastien discovered a document known as the Bordereau in a waste bin at the German embassy. A note revealing that secret French military information had been passed to the German military attaché in Paris. Bastien, who was supposed to burn the attaché's waste, instead forwarded the note to Major Hubert Joseph Henry, hoping it might interest French intelligence. The army immediately launched a hunt for a spy. But it wasn't long before this turned into a search for a scapegoat, rather than a proper legal investigation. Fueled by rising anti-Semitism, suspicion quickly fell on a Jewish captain, Alfred Dreyfus. Dreyfus was Jewish, born in Alsace, and spoke French with a German accent. In an era of growing anti-Semitism in France, his identity made him an easy target. Despite the absence of direct evidence, handwriting similarities were cited to accuse him. In truth, the handwriting on the bordereau belonged to another officer, Major Ferdinand Wolfson Esterhazy. However, the army not only ignored this possibility, but refused to conduct a fair trial. Secret documents were submitted to the court without the defense ever seeing them. The hearings were held behind closed doors. In 1894, Dreyfus was convicted of high treason. The trial was driven not by law, but by institutional self-protection and anti-Semitic prejudice. On January 5th, a public degradation ceremony took place at the Morland Court of the École Militaire in Paris. And to the sound of drums, Dreyfus stood before an official who formally delivered the court's decision. In accordance with military procedure, a Republican Guard officer removed his uniform insignia during an official ceremony. As he walked through the streets, some members of the crowd voiced strong reactions. Under intense public attention, Dreyfus was sent to lifelong exile on Devil's Island, located off the Atlantic coast. Lieutenant Colonel Georges Piquart, newly appointed as the head of military intelligence, reopened the case. After analyzing the available materials, he concluded that another officer, Major Ferdinand Wolfson Esterhazy, was responsible for the security breach. Shortly after sharing his findings, Pickwatt was reassigned. Acknowledging mistakes in the original investigation became increasingly difficult for both political and military leadership. The Dreyfus Affair caused significant division within French society. People were split between those who believed in Dreyfus's innocence and those who opposed revisiting the case. The writer Émile Zola emerged as a central figure by publishing his open letter, J'accuse, which drew national focus to the matter. In it, he accused the military of framing Dreyfus and highlighted the role of Major du Paty de Clam in the conspiracy. Zola's article caused a national uproar. Many intellectuals and artists joined him in calling for a retrial. Émile Duclos, Marcel Proust, Claude Monet, and Émile Durkheim. Due to his public position, Zola became the subject of a legal response. However, increased public interest and growing support for a new review helped bring renewed attention to the case. While the initial verdict remained in effect for a period, changes in the political climate in 1902 led to further examination of the matter as additional information came to light. Were forced to admit that the documents had been forged. Dreyfus was exonerated of treason. After years of exile and psychological torment, he was reinstated into the army with the rank of artillery major. He retired the following year, but returned to duty in 1914 when war broke out, participating in one of the bloodiest battles of the conflict, the Battle of Verdun. Yet the Dreyfus Affair was more than just a judicial scandal. It was a turning point that exposed deep internal rifts in France. It laid bare the ongoing struggle between the military and civilian authority at the heart of the Third Republic, and the tension between secularism and religion. As a result of the affair, secularism would be redefined. The 1905 law on the separation of church and state, which sharply limited the church's role in public life, was a direct product of this polarization. As France faced a turbulent century ahead, the country was far from unified at home. While navigating this internal turmoil, France was also making vital moves in foreign policy. The 1894 military alliance, signed with Russia, marked the beginning of a new strategic direction. Since 1871, France had been working to construct an anti-German foreign policy. In the event of war, Germany would now face threats from both East and West. This alliance was also a political lifeline for France, which had endured years of diplomatic isolation in Europe. French capital began flowing into Russian railroads and industry. This was the first link in a new chain of alliances. The second step was to repair relations with Britain. Like France, Britain had ample reason to fear Germany. An alliance, or at least a rapprochement, with Britain would be highly beneficial for France. However, the two countries had been rivals for centuries, both in Europe and in the colonial world. Since the mid-19th century, both nations had expanded their interests in Southeast Asia. Britain, seeking to secure the eastern frontier of India and gain access to China from the south, was focused on regions such as Myanmar and Thailand. France, on the other hand, was expanding in Indochina. But as France pushed westward from Indochina toward Myanmar and India, it began to pose a threat to Britain. French expansion in the region was a clear signal that it intended to engage with both China and India. Egypt represented another flashpoint. The long-standing competition over control of Egypt intensified after the opening of the Suez Canal. The anti-foreign uprising, led by Urabi Pasha, drew both Britain and France deeper into the region. Although there were plans for joint intervention, the French government, wary of provoking Germany, chose not to take part. As a result, when Britain invaded in 1882, Egypt effectively became a British colony, though it was never formally recognized as such by France. During the same years, the colonial struggle was not limited to Asia and the Mediterranean. Europe was, in a sense, rediscovering Africa. In the mid-19th century, European explorers and adventurers began venturing beyond Africa's well-known coastal regions, such as the Cape of Good Hope and the North African shores, into the heart of the continent. The Scottish missionary and explorer David Livingstone began his African expeditions in 1840. Following the course of the Zambezi River, he became one of the first Europeans to cross the continent from west to east. In 1855, he introduced to Europe the massive waterfall known to locals as Mosi Tunya, today located on the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe, renaming it Victoria Falls. These discoveries received wide coverage in the European press and turned Livingstone into a heroic figure. When he disappeared during one of his journeys and went unheard from for years, journalist Henry Morton Stanley was dispatched to find him and would go on to continue his exploration. Between 1874 and 1877, Stanley explored the sources of the Nile and charted many of the Congo River's tributaries. His accounts of the Congo interior and its navigable waterways caught the attention of King Leopold II of Belgium. But these expeditions quickly became a trend across Europe. In particular, British exploration teams, figuratively speaking, tore through Africa's uncharted forests. As a result, Europe's growing knowledge of previously unknown regions whetted the appetites of many colonial powers. French explorers also started claiming land in the Congo basin, igniting a scramble for territory. By backing Portugal's historical claims, France managed to gain control of the mouth of the Congo River. But the scramble for Africa was not limited to Britain and France. Other European powers soon joined the race. A crisis erupted as Britain gained advantages in the region. Belgium, France, and Germany refused to recognize Britain's dominance there. In fact, Bismarck had initially been skeptical of colonial ventures in Africa. In an 1882 speech before the Reichstag, he declared, "As long as I'm Chancellor, colonial policy is out of the question. We have no navy to speak of, and no means of holding overseas territories that would be seized by the French in the event of war." But the following year, under pressure from German merchants, Bismarck changed his position. In the winter of 1883 to 84, he sent a cruiser to the Gulf of Guinea to conduct a survey along the Cameroon coast. However, Germany's main interest lay in southwest Africa. German traders had been active in the region since the 1840s. Bismarck seized this opportunity, and in 1884 declared that what would later be called German Southwest Africa was under German protection. German expeditions continued, leading to the annexation of Cameroon and later Togo. With the French, Belgians, Germans, British, and Portuguese all scrambling for land, Africa quickly became the symbol of new imperialism. As more and more territories fell under European control, tensions among the imperial powers escalated. At the invitation of King Leopold II and the initiative of Bismarck, Germany called for an international conference to discuss the African question. Held in Berlin in 1885, the conference produced the Berlin Act, formalizing what became known as the Scramble for Africa. One aim of this act was to shift European tensions to non-European territory. But this new arena of colonial competition would give rise to serious crises, particularly between the two pillars of European power, Britain and France. With the acceleration of colonial expansion, France pushed eastward from Senegal into the Sahara and Sudan. The key waterway connecting Senegal to Sudan was the Niger River. In 1883, the French established a presence at Bamako on the Niger. France's movement into this region alarmed the British, who had already entered Nigeria in 1879 and controlled much of the lower and middle Niger River. As France advanced along the river, Britain declared the area under its protection in 1887, effectively taking direct control. At the same time, Britain, France, and Germany clashed over the eastern coast of Africa. France sought to seize Madagascar, a territory with historically close ties to Britain. In response, Britain encouraged the local rulers to resist French influence. Likewise, the French worked to undermine Britain in Zanzibar and its surrounding regions. The most dangerous crisis between the two powers, however, unfolded in Fashoda. In May 1894, Britain signed a treaty with the Congo Free State, leasing territory stretching as far north as Fashoda. This effectively placed the Congo Free State between Sudan and French Congo. But since this corridor sat between the Congo Free State and German East Africa, both France and Germany objected to the agreement. France, claiming that Sudan was still legally Ottoman territory, insisted that Britain had no authority to make such a deal. With German support, France succeeded in forcing Britain to abandon the treaty. Nevertheless, it had become clear that the next major goal of British imperialism was the conquest of Sudan. Securing the route to India was a matter the British government would not gamble on. In March 1896, a joint British-Egyptian force of 20,000 men under Lord Kitchener set out and captured Dongola. They began constructing a railway southward and slowly advanced. Later, they seized Kassala, then under Italian control, and gained control over the Blue Nile. Though the campaign was temporarily halted due to disease, the offensive resumed in 1898. After defeating local forces, the British reached Fashoda in September 1898, only to receive a shock. As the British approached from the north, the French, led by Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand, had been advancing from the south. Marchand had reached Fashoda 2 months earlier and raised the French flag over the fort. In a surprising twist, the meeting between the two forces was marked by unusual cordiality. Kitchener and Marchand agreed to wait for orders from their respective governments. So cordial was the encounter that the two men reportedly shared whiskey, with Marchand later joking that drinking, "It had been one of the greatest sacrifices I ever made for my country." In the immediate aftermath of the Fashoda encounter, diplomatic steps were taken. The Dreyfus Affair was still shaking France from within. The British distributed French newspapers to French soldiers, warning that France was in no condition to fully support Marchand and his troops. During the crisis, Britain maintained a firm and confident stance. In his memoirs, Edward Grey wrote, "It appeared that the French commander who had planted his flag would only yield to force. That meant war between France and Britain. It was impossible for Britain to accept any foreign claim over the Nile Valley. There was only one thing to do, to demand the withdrawal of French forces." While Britain remained determined, French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcassé faced intense pressure from the French public over the Fashoda issue. On September 27th, Delcassé told the British ambassador, "If there are no negotiations, conflict will be inevitable. Do not corner me." But Britain paid no heed to these pleas and instead increased its pressure. Faced with this reality, France could not risk war with Britain. In November 1898, ordered General Marchand to withdraw from Fashoda. A colonial war between Britain and France had been narrowly averted through France's retreat. As the number of African colonial crises grew, tensions between European powers deepened. France entered the 20th century beset by both internal and external turmoil. Foreign Minister Delcassé sought to expand France's alliances to counter the rising power of Germany, strengthening the 1894 Franco-Russian alliance and adding Britain to it became a crucial objective for France. Delcassé's willingness to de-escalate the Fashoda crisis and reconcile with Britain marked the first serious step in ending decades of estrangement between the two countries. With the death of Queen Victoria, her son Edward VII ascended to the throne. Edward was a noted Francophile. He had spent much of his life in Paris and on the French Riviera, spoke and deeply admired French culture. Upon becoming king, he expressed regret over the strained Anglo-French relations and actively sought rapprochement. history would soon assist his efforts. Prime Minister Salisbury, a staunch isolationist, resigned and was replaced by Lord Balfour. Anti-French politicians who had previously advocated an alliance with Germany began losing influence, while moderates more open to France rose to power. Delcassé, who had become foreign minister in June 1898, had openly stated that his primary goal was reconciliation with Britain. According to him, if France wished to expand its colonial empire and one day reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, it would need to end its century-old hostility toward Britain. In the words of Napoleon, reconciliation with perfidious Albion, had become necessary. Beginning in mid-1902, talks between the two sides grew warmer. Within this climate, King Edward VII visited Paris on his own initiative. He was not warmly welcomed at first. At the initial reception, the crowd shouted slogans like "Long live the Boers," "Long live General Marchand," and "Long live Fashoda." But the king's charming and diplomatic demeanor quickly softened the mood. He declared, "I am certain that the days of hostility between our two countries are over. I know of no other nations whose prosperity is so closely tied. There may have been disagreements and grievances in the past, but thankfully, they are behind us. The friendship of our two nations has always been a cherished hope of mine." Following these remarks, the warmth and hospitality shown toward Edward VII began to erase the bitter memories between the nations. The king's speeches increasingly emphasized Franco-British friendship. Interestingly, his visit to Paris was followed by a trip to Berlin, as he was making a diplomatic tour of European capitals. Germany's ambassador in Paris, in a report to Berlin, downplayed the visit, insisting that any Anglo-French rapprochement would be neither sincere nor lasting. But the Germans were mistaken. In July 1903, French President Émile Loubet, accompanied by Delcassé, paid a reciprocal visit to Britain. Discussions between Delcassé and British Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne during this visit would bear fruit 8 months later. President Loubet declared, "France holds your visit to Paris as a cherished memory. I am confident it will yield the happiest results and will serve greatly to strengthen relations between our two nations, to our mutual benefit and for the peace of the world." At that time, the main obstacle to full reconciliation was the issue of Morocco. Since seizing Algeria in 1830, France had taken a keen interest in Moroccan affairs. Morocco's strategic location at the mouth of the Mediterranean had drawn the attention of many European powers. Italy, having lost Tunisia to France, turned its gaze toward Morocco, but France managed to deflect Italian interest by allowing Italy a free hand in Tripolitania. Meanwhile, Britain, having long viewed France as a rival, was unwilling to see Morocco fall under French influence. At the same time, Germany was also interested in Morocco as a potential colony on the Atlantic coast, a market for exports, a source of iron ore, and a potential naval base. German appetite was growing. After the loss of Egypt and Sudan, France turned its eyes to Morocco as compensation. This strategic shift brought France and Britain back to the negotiating table. Britain entered the 20th century engaged on multiple fronts, fighting the Boer War in Africa, engaged in a naval arms race with Germany, and seeking to contain Russian expansion in the Mediterranean. The age of splendid isolation was nearing its end. Britain now needed a reliable partner, and France was that partner. It was in this context that the Entente Cordiale was born. The agreement ended the long-standing colonial disputes between the two powers. France pledged not to obstruct British actions in Egypt, while Britain recognized France's right to maintain order and implement reforms in Morocco. The colonial rivalry in the Mediterranean was effectively resolved. The Entente Cordiale did not, by itself, create a formal alliance between Britain and France, but it did mark the end of nearly 1,000 years of intermittent hostility. For France, the agreement was especially significant. It marked the final end of its diplomatic isolation since 1871. Anglo-French relations, strained since the Crimean War, were finally beginning to thaw. And this was only the first step. The next was rapprochement with Russia. Throughout the 19th century, Britain and Russia had been bitter imperial rivals. Since the early 1800s, Russia had pushed into Persian territory, threatening British interests in India through the Iran-Afghanistan corridor. After the disaster of the Crimean War, Russia turned its expansionist ambitions eastward. In Central Asia, Russian efforts accelerated. The Turkic Khanates became the next targets of Tsarist policy. Russia seized Chimkent in 1864, Tashkent in 1865, and established the Governorate General of Turkestan in 1867. It captured Samarkand in 1868, moved against Khiva in 1873, annexed the Kokand Khanate in 1876, and seized Merv in 1884. Russian activities in Tibet raised serious alarm in London. As Russia expanded across Central and East Asia, Britain's anxieties grew. Russia's expansion through Siberia into the Far East would soon prompt a reaction from Britain. When Japan, the rising power in East Asia, defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894, its growing influence alarmed the European powers. Germany, Russia, and France intervened to limit Japan's gains. Britain, however, refused to join this intervention. As a result, relations between Britain and Japan started to warm. It was inevitable that Russia's imperial ambitions in the Far East would eventually clash with those of Japan. Britain, in turn, had finally found a partner capable of teaching the Russians a lesson in Asia. In January 1902, Britain and Japan signed an alliance treaty, marking the end of Britain's splendid isolation. The alliance would soon bear fruit. When the Russo-Japanese War broke out in 1904, Britain did not officially participate, but it provided Japan with crucial support, especially in intelligence and espionage. British agents disrupted Russian communications, giving Japan a significant strategic advantage. During the conflict, Britain also intercepted secret correspondence between Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas II, revealing Germany's attempts to push Russia into war against Britain. The war ended in a devastating defeat for Russia, which would deeply affect its future foreign policy. Russia found itself in complete diplomatic isolation. Wherever it tried to expand its influence, whether in Asia or abroad, it encountered British resistance. France, meanwhile, proved unable to support Russia meaningfully. The Tsarist regime, adrift and alone, was further destabilized by internal unrest, culminating in the 1905 revolution. This domestic turmoil marked a turning point in Russian diplomacy. Alexander Izvolsky abandoned the far eastern ambitions of his predecessor, Vladimir Lambsdorff, and instead sought reconciliation with Russia's rivals. The Tsarist regime made a swift pivot away from East Asia, choosing instead to focus on European politics, which it deemed more in line with its historical and strategic interests. Adding to Russia's concerns was the growing German influence in the Ottoman Empire. With the Berlin-Baghdad railway project, Germany was expanding toward the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. France and Britain had previously attempted joint negotiations to limit this expansion, but these talks had failed. For Russia, this meant that dangerous isolation was no longer just a possibility, it had become a reality. At the same time, Britain began viewing the prospect of a rapprochement with Russia more favorably. In late 1905, British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey stated, "If Russia sincerely and wholeheartedly accepts our intent to maintain peaceful control over our Asian possessions, then I am confident that no British government will seek to obstruct Russia's policies in Europe. Quite the opposite. We would welcome the restoration of Russia's position and influence in the European concert." In a letter to the Russian ambassador, Grey went even further. It is not for us to propose changes to the treaty conditions regarding the Dardanelles. But if Russia does so, we consider such changes acceptable and would be ready to discuss them. As a result of this strategic shift, Izvolsky proposed a formal agreement to Britain in October 1906. This was precisely the initiative the British Foreign Office had been waiting for. While negotiations continued, a Russian naval fleet paid a visit to Portsmouth, and at King Edward VII's invitation, a delegation of Russian sailors came to London. After the seemingly impossible Anglo-French Entente, the Anglo-Russian rapprochement was now taking shape. Following these diplomatic overtures, the two countries signed an agreement in August 1907. Like the Entente Cordiale, the accord focused on colonial spheres of influence. Russia pledged to end all direct involvement in Afghanistan and agreed to conduct all relations via Britain. In return, Britain promised not to invade or annex Afghanistan. Northern Persia, the most populous and economically vital region, would fall under Russian influence. The southeast, a barren and desert-filled region containing the routes from Persia to India, will belong to the British sphere. The central region between them was designated as neutral, and both sides agreed not to seek advantage there without mutual consent. Britain was more than satisfied with the agreement. On paper, we both gained, but in practice, we gave up nothing. Our gains were real. Russia's were only apparent. And thus, the foundations of the Triple Entente between France, Britain and Russia were laid. By resolving their long-standing disputes, the three powers grew closer and began coordinating their foreign policies. No longer constrained by competing colonial interests. As the storm of Great War loomed on the horizon, the Entente secured its footing. And now, only the spark remained,